So we're sitting on the deck of the Spur Cottage where Dibbie Appleton now resides. And with me now is Dibbie. And Dibbie, I wanted to find out, did you have a name for this cottage or a name that you called it?
I have a name that I use. The other side of the family that comes does not use it.
Uh-huh.
We call it Stony Lonesome.
And where did that name come from?
Stony Lonesome I first heard about from Aunt Helen Cook, who was my mother's sister and who lived next door where Courts now live. And she used to talk about walking up to Stony Lonesome. And her brother was a doctor from Rochester, New York, Crawford Brown. And he would come up and tramp through the woods to Stony Lonesome, and he was their doctor.
And how big would Stony Lonesome have been?
I have no idea. I think it was a tiny settlement. They had a school and they had a little library, but these were little log buildings. And I finally went to I went to the township office and asked Brenda Chevalier there if she knew who could tell me about Stony Lonesome, and she said, sure, Joe Catercio could show you where it is. So I called this Joe Catercio, and Joe said, sure, I'll take you and your aunt up there. So we got in my VW bus with the door open and rode up Miller's Hill Road until Joe said, stop. And he said, this is where the village was.
Huh.
It's about halfway to the radio tower. That's up on the top.
Are there any remnants of the village there?
I saw nothing. Absolutely nothing. But Aunt Helen kept saying, I told you so. I told you there was a village called Stony Lonesome. And because it had meant so much to Uncle Croft, that village was there, and I guess he meant something to the villagers because it was a free doctor that arrived up here. And Uncle Croft had given his land that he had bought, that we're sitting on, to my mother and father to build a cottage. So I decided Stony Lonesome was a good name for the cottage.
Perfect. And
so that's why I call it that.
Yes. And Uncle Croft. So what was his full name?
Crawford Brown.
Crawford Brown.
I don't know what his middle name. Probably McDowell.
Yeah. So Crawford Brown.
And he was grandmother's, Mrs. Brown's youngest son. Fought in World War II, and he died of complications many, many years later, I think, relating back to war.
Mm-hmm. And you're a Spur.
I'm a Spur.
So can you explain to me a little bit about how just the Spur family and the few generations back from you, and also the relation to Trudy Hay, who's also was up on this lake?
Okay. My mother was Margaret Brown. She married Arthur Clinton Spur, and they lived for many years in the summers with grandmother next door. And when mother got pregnant with me, we were going to exceed the room for our family next door. So they began talking about building a cottage. And so they contracted Peterson, and this cottage was completed in 1941, which tells you about how old I am. There were 3 of us in the family: Penelope, my older sister, my brother Ben Spur, and myself. When I was born, my parents brought another child to live with us, and her name was Trudy. Trudy and my father share the same father, the Archdeacon Benjamin Moore Spur of West Virginia. But after my dad's mom died, the Archdeacon remarried someone named Gertrude Spur, and they had a little girl named Trudy. Mm-hmm. Gertrude's name was actually Spur before she married the Archdeacon. So somewhere way back, they may have been related. I don't know.
That's interesting.
That probably should not go in this video. However, they had a little girl, and at some point, her mother died. I think her mother died before the father. I'm not sure. I may have it backwards. But when Trudy was left living alone with no parent, my mom and dad brought her to live with us.
How old would Trudy have been at that age?
I think she was 13.
Uh-huh.
And I came into the world, and so I grew up with what I thought were 2 older sisters. Trudy and Penelope.
Right.
Trudy a tiny bit older than Penelope. And it wasn't until years later that I could understand this strange relationship, that Trudy was really my father's half-sister.
Huh. So your aunt.
So she is really my aunt.
Mm-hmm.
But to me, she's my sister.
Yes.
And she got married to someone that she met up here on the lake, Dr. John Hay. And he was from Pittsburgh, and they got their own cottage, and they have 2 sons who still come
to the
enjoy
lake.
the lake.
Right.
John and David Hay.
Yes.
My brother, Benjamin Spur, died at the age of 57. And Penelope and I now share the ownership of this cottage.
Okay. Thank you very much. So this is a continuation of an interview with Dibbie Appleton. And also with me is my father, Robert Moffat, who may have some things to say as well. But I'm primarily interviewing Dibbie. And Dibbie, how was it that your family ever came to Penn Lake?
Probably quite by accident. Grandmother had 4 children. Lou Brown, Margaret Brown, later Spur, my mother, her younger sister Helen Brown Cook, and the youngest in the family was Crawford Brown, who was a doctor from Rochester.
And your grandmother's name was?
Ellen McDowell Brown.
Okay.
Actually, she had several other names, but we'll do the shortened one. They had gone to the seashore, to Rehoboth Beach. They had gone to the mountains, but Aunt Helen was still a frail child, and grandmother was talking to someone who happened to live on Wolf Island here on Penn Lake, who said if you came to Muskoka, the child would get strong and well. Mm-hmm. So they came to Deerhurst, I believe, in 1908. It might be 1906. Mm-hmm. I have their signing in registry on the wall in the house. And so they came to Penn Lake, and grandmother ended up borrowing the rowboat from the Deerhurst Lodge, which was just a small inn at the time, and rowed as far away from the inn as she could get and bought land from Robert Meredith, who owned all these farmlands. And so that's how they got to the lake. They adored it. Aunt Helen, indeed, lived the longest of all the siblings, so Muskoka did its thing for her.
Now, Meredith also built the house that Margaret Moffat lives in now.
He built that beautiful house up on the Portage Road in the hopes that his mail-order bride would arrive to share it with him and make a life with him. And sadly, that mail-order bride never arrived. So Meredith ended up childless, and his heir was Tom Shaw, who built the farm behind our property here. And people from all over the lake used to come and land at the dock and go up there to get vegetables and corn from Tom Shaw. You couldn't beat Tom Shaw's corn. He had 2 sisters. One was Leah Blackwell, and the other was, I can't remember her first name, but she married someone named Reddy. And they built 2 houses further down the shore here. Mm-hmm. And when they were finished with those houses and were moving away, my mother and father bought those properties in order to allow them to fall down and return to nature and protect this shoreline. Mm-hmm.
And your Aunt Helen's cottage, which is the one next door to your current Spur cottage, that was sold.
We inherited, my brother and sister and I inherited it from Aunt Helen, and we already had 1 cottage to manage, and 2 was going to be too much. And Aunt Helen had talked to Debbie Eastmuir Court about the cottage before she died, and we honored that conversation that she had, and they moved in, and they took beautiful care of the old cottage until it was just too much, at which point that came down and they built the year-round house. Mm-hmm.
Now you were telling me earlier about Eastmuir and how he ended up with that point of land.
Wyburn Eastmuir, grandmother apparently threw quite a party on Saturday nights. They had no electricity, but they still had parties. And they would roll up the rugs and have a square dance. And a young man came one night to a square dance, and his name was Wyburn Eastmuir. And he brought with him someone called Tog Ogle. And at some point they were talking with grandmother, and Wyburn said he would just give his left arm to have property on Penn Lake. And grandmother asked him if he'd put his money where his mouth was, and he said absolutely. And so Meredith sold Wyburn a piece of property just south of her cottage. They didn't build, I believe, until 1936, but that's where Penrock stands today, and that's where Joan Pratt lives. So he got land from Meredith as well.
Ah, okay. That's interesting. You had mentioned that your aunt had all these parties and that Weyburn Eastmere had come up here. And you'd mentioned, I think, why Ogle or?
No, it's Wyburn Eastmere.
Yes.
And what I forgot to say was that Wyburn was an army buddy of Togue Ogle. And Ogle brought Wyburn up to the lake. And the Ogles had a place on Denelg, which some people call Hills Island.
Yes.
And I think they were already on Penn Lake when he introduced Wyburn to my grandmother.
And this Togue, is that Vi Ogle's husband?
You know, I think it's a brother.
It's not a husband. I don't think
Vi never married.
never married.
I have to plead that I don't know.
Okay.
Right now.
Because Vi Ogle was a real...
It would not
Okay.
surprise me that they were brother and sister, but
uh-huh.
I could be dead wrong.
Okay. Okay. Thanks.